I recently watched a video aimed at photographers that claimed modern cameras only have two real ISO settings and that RAW files just contain the chosen ISO in the metadata. Then your RAW conversion software will adjust the exposure appropriately based on that ISO in the metadata. So a RAW file shot at ISO 100 and another shot at ISO 400, with all their other settings being the same, would both contain the same data. Just the RAW conversion software would boost the exposure of the ISO 400 image by 2 stops compared to the ISO 100 image. Now, the first part about most cameras only having two real ISO settings or gain settings, as far as I know, is correct. But the second part about the ISO just being metadata did not match my experience. So I decided to test it in case I was mistaken, as if it was correct that ISO is just metadata, then I think I would probably find that quite useful. The video in question did not contain any actual test results to demonstrate the points it was making, and it has since been taken down, which I think gives a clue as to how correct it was. Anyway, I've now tested this with my Canon R5 and Sony a7 IV, and sadly can confirm that my understanding was correct and the ISO setting is not just metadata. For this first set of tests, I took an image exposed to the right at ISO 100, then I boosted the ISO in 1-stop increments in the camera. In Adobe Camera Raw, I then pulled the exposure back down to match the ISO 100 image. As you can see, we cannot recover the blown highlight data. This is the same for both cameras, and I get the same result in RAW therapy or ACR. Unfortunately, both RAW converters limit you to 5 stops of negative exposure compensation, but this is enough to prove the point anyway. We can also look at the images pre-demosaic in RAW therapy or RAW digger and see that they are indeed different brightnesses. Clearly, at least for these two cameras, ISO is not just metadata. For the second test, we do the opposite, exposing an ISO 12800 image to the right, then reducing the ISO in 1-stop increments in the camera while keeping all other settings the same. Then we boost the exposure of the images in our RAW converter to match the ISO 12800 image. Here we can see all the images look very similar, and I suspect that this is where their confusion in thinking ISO is metadata has come from. I should note that while I don't really see any difference in the noise in this test, modern cameras typically have two native ISO levels, which might be something like ISO 100 and ISO 400. If your image requires exposure around the higher gain level, say at ISO 320 in this example, then you may get a better result shooting at the higher gain level of ISO 400 and reducing the exposure 1/3 stop from there, rather than shooting below that second native ISO. Next test is video. I exposed for the scene at ISO 100 in photo mode, then moved to video mode, keeping the settings the same but varying the ISO. With RAW video on the Canon, our minimum ISO is 800. If we reduce the exposure by 3 stops in the Camera Raw tab in DaVinci, and then apply a C-Log to Rec. 709 LUT, we get a result very close to a still photo shot at ISO 100. Next, looking at H.265 footage on the Canon in S-Log 3. Again, the base ISO here is 800. I use the offset tool in DaVinci to try and approximate 3 stops of exposure reduction. The blacks are crushed due to the simplistic way I tried to reduce the exposure. If you adjust the gain, gamma and lift, you can easily achieve a much better result. In H.265, you can reduce the ISO below 800 at the expense of dynamic range. As we reduce the ISO down, we can see there's not really any difference versus the ISO 800 result. Now looking at Sony, starting with a photo at ISO 100 again. Now looking at Rec. 709 footage, not log, we can see that as the ISO increases, we cannot recover the exposure. I also found that these needed a much larger offset adjustment to equate to 1 stop than the Canon log footage. With S-Log 3, which has a minimum ISO of 800, I found it harder to match the ISO 100 photo, but we can see it is possible, just the image is a bit desaturated, even with the S-Log 3 to Rec. 709 LUT applied. So what we can say from these tests is that no, ISO is not just metadata. The gain is applied in the camera at the time the photo or video is taken. We can also see that exposing so that the brightest highlight where you want to retain detail is just about clipping in the camera is good advice. In post, we can then pull the exposure down to reduce noise, or push the shadows up to maximise the dynamic range of the image. And when shooting log footage, we can see that exposing the image as if it was shot at ISO 100, that is, so log footage at ISO 800 will look 3 stops overexposed, can give a reasonable result, though shooting 2 stops overexposed is probably more sensible. But what we can also say is that ISO when shooting RAW certainly could be metadata if the camera manufacturers and RAW converters would implement it. An ISO 100 image pushed 2 stops looks pretty much the same as an ISO 400 image, so quite easily the camera could record images at either one of the 2 real gain levels depending on the ISO setting, and then just push the exposure up in post as necessary to whatever ISO is recorded in the metadata. This would make life simpler, as you could expose at higher ISO values in the camera to get a good preview image, while not worrying so much about blown highlight data, as you could just recover it in post.